Welcome everyone to Raise the Roof. Today my co-host Leroy Hill and I are joined by Owen Anderson to offer a biblically sound and philosophically robust discussion of Friedrich Nietzsche's 1886 book, Beyond Good and Evil. We'll explore how Nietzsche's atheist morality stands behind most of today's social conflicts, shaped the Western worldview, and maybe even deformed the worldview of many Christians. Before we dive into our analysis of Nietzsche's worldview, let's deal with the real challenge. How should we pronounce his name? Is it Nietzsche or Nietzsche? To answer this burning question, I'll rely on this video from Julian Mikel, who I'm probably not saying his name right, but from his YouTube channel. Here's what he has to say.
Now, his name in German would normally be pronounced Friedrich Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche. However, in English, his name is normally pronounced Friedrich Nietzsche. Some people say Nietzsche. It's really not close from the normal German pronunciation, so do not say Nietzsche, but rather Nietzsche.
All right, so I've got to admit, I'm often inconsistent in pronouncing Nietzsche's name, but I will do my best. So with that caveat in mind, let me offer this summary of Nietzsche's life and influence based largely on the biography published in volume 43 of the Great Books of the Western World. Friedrich Nietzsche was born on October 15, 1844 in Prussian Saxony. His family was religious, his grandfather was a Lutheran minister, and he came from a long line of religious people. But Friedrich's father passed away when he was just 5. So in 1850, the family moved to Nuremberg, where he was raised by his grandmother, mother's sister, and 2 aunts. It's interesting to note that some scholars think this upbringing might have influenced Nietzsche's view on women. We won't cover that in the show today, but might be something worth looking into. Nietzsche received some of the finest schooling. In 1858, he was given free admission to an outstanding preparatory school in a nearby town. There, his intellectual brilliance was soon recognized, and he was the first among his peers in the study of the classics. In 1864, he went to Bonn to pursue the study of classics and theology. Nietzsche's academic journey took a turn, however, when a disagreement with 2 professors led him to leave university after only 2 semesters. In 1865, he followed one of his classical philology professors to the University of Leipzig, where he dropped his study of theology and focused on Schopenhauer's philosophy and Wagner's music. In 1867, Nietzsche joined the military but was injured and forced to return to Leipzig. While continuing his studies, Nietzsche was recommended for a professorship in classics at the University of Basel in Switzerland. Now, what's interesting is despite not even completing his degree, he was still appointed to this position in 1869. It's during this time that his first book was published in 1872. It was called The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music. This first edition included a preface dedicated to Wagner, with whom he had friendly visits. After this first work was published, between 1873 and 1876, Nietzsche published 4 meditations. The 4th work is most interesting here because it reflected his growing rift with Wagner. He was troubled by Wagner's attacks on the French and the Jews, his nationalism, and the betrayal of atheism that he perceived when Wagner used Christian themes in his operas. Now, these differences led to an open break in 1878 and a direct attack on Wagner in 1888. This is actually kind of an interesting fact because we can see that Nietzsche struggled to develop deep relationships with people throughout his life. And so this rift with Wagner, I think, played some role in how he saw the world. It was in the midst of this growing rift with Wagner that Nietzsche's ill health forced him to resign from his professorship in 1879. The university granted him a 6-year pension, which allowed him to spend summers in Switzerland and winters in the warmer climates of Italy and France. In 1882, he published The Gay Science, which included 383 numbered sections, some aphorisms and poems on various topics. This book was followed in 1883 to 1885 by the 4 parts of the work that is his literary masterpiece, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. This work was Nietzsche's favorite, wherein he put his entire worldview really into the mouth of Zarathustra. Now, in some ways, the clearest and most systematic exposition of Nietzsche's philosophy appeared in his 1886 book that we're looking at today, Beyond Good and Evil, with the subtitle Prelude to a Philosophy of the Future. The title of this book was Nietzsche's call to a revolution against the ideal of good and evil as fixed and universal concepts. Nietzsche believed that these moral categories were mere cultural, religious, or social fictions, as we might call them today. So as we discuss in the show, Nietzsche had a particular hatred for Christian ethics, which he called the slave morality. In place of this evil system of fixed dogma, he advocated for the will to power, where individuals could create their own good based on strength, creativity, and authenticity. As you can imagine, Nietzsche had difficulty finding a publisher. When he finally did, his book was like a lot of Hollywood Oscar-winning movies. The critics love it, but the broader public didn't care to read it. For example, his book was criticized in Switzerland as promoting anarchy. In response to this criticism, Nietzsche wrote On the Genealogy of Morals in 1887. So based on my reading, I suspect that a lot of Nietzsche's thoughts and ideas, his real worldview is shaped by his bad health and lonely life, free from any romantic love. Here, let me quote from volume 43 of the Great Books of the Western World because it's put very well. Throughout his life, Nietzsche suffered from ill health. At the age of 18, his school teacher reported that he suffered from migraine headaches and stomach pains. In 1868, his military service was cut short when he suffered a severe chest wound while mounting a horse. While serving as a volunteer medical orderly during the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, he had dysentery and diphtheria, the effects of which remained with him for the rest of his life. He was nearsighted and suffered from eye troubles. Unable to sleep, he frequently took narcotics. Then in the streets of Turin, Italy, in January of 1889, he collapsed. Notes sent to friends and relatives indicated that he had little control over his mind. A friend took him back to an asylum in Basel. He was cared for by his mother until her death in 1897. After that, by his sister until his death in Weimar, August 25th, 1900. In all, he lived these final 11 years with his mind completely gone. His death was attributed to general paresis caused by syphilis. And as it said a moment ago, Nietzsche died in the care of his sister, Elizabeth Forrester, and she kept a tight control of her brother's literary estate. That fact has done great harm to the interpretation of Nietzsche's thought and to his reputation. The husband of his sister was a leading and extreme nationalist, anti-Semite, and his wife did all she could to manipulate Nietzsche's writings, even to the extent of forging them to model them after her husband. Selective use and publication of them by Nazis with their support have thus sometimes made Nietzsche appear as a precursor to Hitler and Nazi ideology. So with that in mind, it's still important to see the influence of Nietzsche. And I think Benjamin Weicker summarizes Nietzsche's influence when he says this in his book. Quote, as the apostle of atheism, Nietzsche heralded the darkest century the world has ever known, end quote. Now, despite this terrible legacy, Nietzsche's works are praised by many philosophers for their brilliance. So that makes it worthy of our study today. With that, let me bring in Leroy and Owen to discuss this influence. Hello, gentlemen.
Great to see you.
Yeah, well, thanks for being here. It's good to be seen. So, Owen, while we're waiting for Leroy to join us, let's talk a little bit about Nietzsche and why this book, you think, just in broad strokes. We're going to unpack the worldview stuff. I don't want to jump too far ahead without Leroy joining us, but at least maybe give some broad strokes why this book, Beyond Good and Evil, or even just Nietzsche himself, is significant for our discussion and explore why should Christians care about this topic.
Yeah, he was sort of the rock star of philosophy. I'm not sure how much that carried over for millennials or Zoomers, but the certainly up until the Xers, if you had a poster up, it would probably either be Einstein with his tongue sticking out or a poster of Nietzsche. And he's sort of the symbol of teenage rebellion. Now, that doesn't necessarily connect with his philosophy, but it's just that he symbolized that, and that's what he wanted. That's what people thought, hey, this is cool. I like him. He says God is dead. And they didn't really have any understanding of what he actually said or what he meant by God is dead. It just sounded good to the teenage guy who wanted to rebel against his Sunday school teacher and his parents. So he has that place in a way that other thinkers may not. Now, I don't think he's the best of the thinkers in that line. I personally think David Hume is much more analytic, more thoughtful, and more devastating because his critique is more pinpointed. like a laser surgery where you could have your head decapitated and not even know it. Nietzsche's more like a teenager, just kind of smashing stuff and rebelling, with a sledgehammer, breaking things. And so it's less, I guess, thought out, but there is some subtlety to Nietzsche.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think that is, just in his background? Let me ask you to pause there. Why do you think that is? Why do you think he's more like a teenager breaking stuff as opposed to more? Because, I mean, he didn't lack for education, and by all accounts, he was sort of brilliant in the humanities and his studies. He got some scholarships when he was young to school, so he seems to be an advanced thinker. But why do you suppose that is? Your take?
Well, I don't mean to imply that he's intellectually like a teenager, but that his rebellion is over philosophical problems that aren't particularly hard to solve.
Oh, I see.
Whereas someone like Hume sees more devastating problems in presuppositions that Christians often miss. And so I'm not suggesting he wasn't intelligent or doing good work. I'm going to talk in a little bit about exactly what that work was. But the things that he's upset about are, it always boils down to the problem of evil. His dad was a Lutheran minister. He suffered greatly while Nietzsche was a young teenager, maybe a 10-ish to 13-ish age range. His father suffering from a horrible disease, sick, dies in agony. And Nietzsche says to himself, wow, my dad, he's serving God. And that's what God does to him. That makes him start to rethink everything. And you'll almost always find the problem of evil is at the heart of any outspoken atheist. If you look into Stephen Hawking, guess what? It's not really calculus and astrophysics that disproved God to him. It's the problem of evil. And so it's just true here with Nietzsche. And it's a very kind of simpleton view, because if you had any small awareness of the scriptures, you would know that a minister suffering is not unique at all. It's not surprising at all. But he doesn't seem to have shown that kind of awareness, or he just dismisses it as, if you serve God, you should never suffer. My dad suffered, so God isn't real.
Yeah, and plus he had his own share of medical health issues his whole life too. So I'm sure that sort of carried on as well in his own thinking.
Yeah, to some extent. Some of those brought on by his own licentiousness, and
Yeah. So, well, let's go with that. So, we're still not going to jump into the worldview questions just yet. As far as our first ones, where did I come from? What happens when I die? But we know he's going from this atheistic type worldview, and what you pointed out there does share some of the uniquenesses about that. But I thought it might also be good because we've gone through 7 or so different philosophers, at least on Raise the Roof. You've been here with a couple of us prior to those. And so I was trying in my own head, think, okay, how could I summarize each of these people in a key phrase or a key idea that might be useful, that might be valuable to people to kind of get what are the big ideas of their contribution and thinking. And I don't know that I've done a great job. Some of them I've just borrowed from what is the popularist ones or the ones that are most common. Others I tried to, kind of use some of the insight from our own show or just my own thinking about those as well. So with that in mind, let's then jump back in. Look at Machiavelli. So if I summarize Machiavelli, my kind of phrasing was, the goal of power justifies the means. I don't know if that's the best way, maybe a kludgy. What do you think about that as summarizing Machiavelli's sort of unique approach? When he says, ultimately, as long as you achieve power, the means don't matter. Is that a fair kind of one phrase summary? I don't know if it's ever fair to maybe one phrase summary anybody, but we'll try our best.
I think that is a fair one in the sense that that's going to be the common way that many Christians understand Machiavelli. I don't think he and Nietzsche are in the same camp, though. I think I would summarize Machiavelli this way: common sense, or this will drive some people crazy, prudence. And what I mean is, if you want to maintain power, these are the things you have to do. You might not want to retain power. You might want to withdraw from life like he did and become a scholar. But if you want to retain power, this is what it's like. He's describing the sausage factory. And that's a reference to Bismarck, who said politics is like making sausage. You like the sausage, you don't want to know how it's made. And so, this is what it takes. This is the kinds of things that happen. And you need to be wise about it. He's sort of describing the wise as a serpent side of be wise as a serpent, gentle as a dove. Whereas Nietzsche is doing something, I think, fundamentally different of critiquing even the ideas of, for example, truth. And he's not doing something new. He's a scholar of the ancient Greeks, and he's a romantic. So putting those two things together, he wants to go back to ancient Greek romanticism, filtered through 19th century European lens. And he thinks that everything went wrong with Socrates. So that's a lot different project than what Machiavelli's doing, although they both do talk about power. That's maybe the connection.
Yeah. Well, and that's where all this gets very tricky, right? Because they use a lot of the same words, but they often mean very different things. Leroy, what did you think about that one sentence summary that I kind of put out there for Machiavelli? The goal of power justifies the means. You think that's great?
Yeah.
You think you have a different take on that one?
Yeah, I think that what Machiavelli is just what Owen was talking about. What Machiavelli is trying to do is tell people how to get in power and how to maintain power. And really what he's saying is that, it's ugly. It's not for nice people. It's not for people who have, strong moral values and strong ethics. It's for people who want to get in power and stay there. And that's his context. And I think when we had that discussion before, I thought it was useful to think about the kind of people that Machiavelli was dealing with. He was dealing with people who were ruthless, and he was trying to, and get, kind of wiggle his way into the good graces of those people who were in power. So he gave them, a rationale for staying in power. I think the distinction with Nietzsche is again, just like what Owen said. What Nietzsche is doing is he's saying, you guys are hypocrites. You claim to have values and you claim to have ethics and morals, and really they don't exist. So let's get to living. Let's get to dealing with what it's like to not have those things. So I think his appeal to power is a little bit different. His appeal to power is, if you want to live in the world and you want to make sense of the world, then you have to give it meaning. You have to make it make sense. And it takes powerful people to do that, not people who are weeping willows sitting on the sidelines, waiting for things to happen.
Okay. Well, so our second one we did was on Descartes. And again, sort of the most used phrase there is, I think, therefore I am. Do you guys think that's a great, still one phrase summary of his ideas? I mean, it's sort of stood the test of time, so I don't think there's a whole lot of controversy in that one. But do you guys still have any other thoughts on one sentence or summaries you think would also be great for Descartes?
That's definitely the one that everyone picks, and they know him. The thing I respond to with that is just that there's kind of an industry of blaming Descartes for modernity. And so they'll say, oh, Descartes ruined the world with I think, therefore I am. But Augustine said that exact same thing in his work on the Trinity. Descartes really is just an Augustinian. And so I don't think you can blame Descartes for the problems of the world. He's not a great, perfect philosopher. But anyway, that's my response. So in other words, it may not be unique to him, but it's definitely what everyone remembers from him.
Yeah. Anything to add to that one, Leroy?
Yeah, I'm going to agree with that. I'm going to ratify that.
All
well,
right.
there you go. You got Leroy's approval, so you must be all right. All right, Hobbes. This one's sort of awkward. I was trying, I'm trying to come up with pithy things. Nobody can come up with, I think, therefore I am, right? That's brilliant. But sort of my Hobbes one was brutish. The brutish man needs a social contract for happiness. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that kind of captures his point of view. I mean, I don't think that I think when we did that talk, he wasn't trying to root it in something, his ideas in something eternal and something objective. I think what he was just attempting to do was to give society order. So I think that kind of fits him. I'm sorry he said more than that, but I mean,
yeah.
Project.
Where they go on?
Yeah, that captures his idea of contract theory coming out of nature, and the words that he uses. Life is short, brutish, and nasty. The other thing that might kind of help with him, because he probably is more of a direct connection to Nietzsche, ideologically, is the sovereign determines good and evil.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. His work on the sovereign was really critical to that, and then we'll see how that. And as we get into Nietzsche's too, we'll see where maybe there's more crossover
I think
too.
that's such a fundamental point, because I think what we see, there's a line that I learned when I first started coming to school, is that people don't escape their context, right? Men don't escape their context. They're arguing within a particular context. And he's showing by his philosophy that he thoroughly is ensconced in, an aristocratic, world. And that's the sum of his, I don't want to say it's some, but that's the thrust of his ideas, is that, the rich and the smart and the elites ought to make decisions for the rest of us.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Well,
What about
he's also
Rousseau?
worried about
Oh, go ahead.
he's also worried about the attempt to overthrow kings. So he's on the monarchist side of the debate in England, where the king just is absolute because he was given that power by God. And so he's defending that view against the English parliamentarians who are saying essentially what leads to the United States. No, that there's a law and it's over the king, and you can judge the king by the law.
Yeah. All right, let's jump on forward to Rousseau a little bit for some context. So Rousseau, I tried to make this short, but at the same time, I'm trying to be fair. So here's the best I could think of. So man is born free, but the arts and sciences put flowers over the chains of civilization that enslave us. How's that for a long, wordy sentence, but decent?
I think it's
summary?
poetic. I like the poetry of it. I'm not as poetic as you, so I would have a similar thing, but I would emphasize man is born good, and private property corrupts him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I like that too. That's more concise.
But it's not as poetic.
That's true. I was going for the poetry, but
But if you had to pick one philosopher who is the one influencing Nietzsche, it's Rousseau.
yeah. So say your summary again. I'm typing this down. I'm gonna put that as a
Man is born good, but private property corrupts him. So you can see that in Nietzsche. You can see how Marx is a Rousseauian.
Yeah. Yeah, I do like that phrasing too, because even if it's not more as lovely and poetic as mine, but I do think it does make logically that connection to the Marx Engels side, and you can kind of trace in that more flow of thought with your. So I really like it for sure.
The difference between the French Revolution and then the English, because Edmund Burke and Locke, and then on our side, even Jefferson, who in some ways admire the French Revolution, but we would all say, no, wait a minute, man's born a sinner, and it's not private property that corrupts him. So that's the essential difference that you still see coming down to us today.
Yeah,
and it's the difference that's in the book, The Closing of the American Mind. He traces those two lines, Locke and Rousseau, and you'll still see. I mean, basically, Rousseau won our universities.
Yeah,
and that's why Nietzsche and Foucault are so popular, because they're just disciples of Rousseau.
Can I ask you a question since you brought him up? Edmund Burke. I got a book by him recently, and I've been trying to wade through it. And I think that him and Thomas Paine are the competing views for the American mind, and I really think, and I'm really beginning to go this way, that Burke should have won out rather than Paine.
Well, I think if you gave those as the two options, absolutely. If it's Burke or Rousseau, Burke or Paine, yeah. There's some things in Burke where he maybe he likes tradition, and so there may be some things in him which is, let's say, arguing for tradition in church against dissenters in England, which means that I'd be on the other side of that debate. But otherwise, yeah, the things that he's arguing for law and order as a basis for society. Yeah, that's right.
One of these days, I want to catch up with you and talk to you about that.
Good, I want to. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe down the road after we finish this whole series, we'll do a show on that.
Yeah, on the right, I think he's going to make a comeback in the sense like that he is the grandfather of English-speaking world conservatism.
All right, what about, let's jump ahead because I still want to get to Rousseau here, but we're getting closer to where our our journey through all the previous episodes. So we did Marx Engels. My sort of one sentence summary is the history of all societies, past, present, and future, is the history of class struggle.
Wow, perfect.
Yeah.
Seems pretty straightforward. And then we see that obviously connection with Rousseau, especially with your phrase, Owen. I think there's a little bit of concise brilliance there. Then we bring in Mill, John Stuart Mill. My phrase was, the greatest happiness is the greatest good, the greatest suffering is the greatest evil. Seem fair enough?
I think that captures utilitarianism, but we also have to do him a favor because he's not just kind of like common sense. If a Zoomer hears what you just said, they'll think he means the society where everyone can afford a Frappuccino is the best society.
Right.
Some kind of physical pleasure, not so his quote, which is another poetic one that might be good for this, is, it'd be better to be a dissatisfied Socrates than a satisfied fool. So the kinds of satisfaction he's talking about is the kind that comes from mental inquiry and knowledge, not simply physical pleasures. And then put that into utilitarianism. The society that has the most Socrateses is the best.
Yeah. I see him as an extension of Hobbes.
Yeah. I mean, we definitely covered that a little bit on the show too.
Yeah, tell us more. Well, if you covered it already, I'll go back and watch.
Oh, no. Yeah, we did cover it a little bit, but your comment, Owen, just reminded me. Yeah, we did deal with that a little bit, how he tried to distance himself from the hedonistic sort of sense of things. And that is important. Even in the, that's the struggle of trying to summarize these things simply, because again, happiness has a different connection. The Constitution, the life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. And there was even struggle then, should they include that piece or not, because there was competing views on what that meant, even at the time, let alone today.
That kind of maybe gets us to Nietzsche now, because you could almost tell your students, anytime in a philosophy class you see the word happiness, it doesn't mean what you think it means, unless you're reading Nietzsche.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's one last person before we jump into Nietzsche, because see, now we're starting to see these connections though that are really important. Darwin, we covered him. Here's my summary. The good of society is the survival of the fittest race of man. And the reason I wanted to put it that way, as opposed to just survival of the fittest, is because I want to draw out that contrast between especially for Darwin, the tribalist, collectivist almost sense of moral goodness within a group of people, where Nietzsche's not going to want to see that tribalist grouping of moral good. So in my thinking through trying to say, okay, how do we, he'll talk about fitness and survival, but in a very different way than Darwin. So trying to draw that out in that summary. Any thoughts on that one though?
Yeah, I think that's great, because that captures his view on the descent of man, which is mostly ignored by Darwinists because it's horrible. And he should be canceled. But it captures that side of it. If you're trying to capture the other side of it, Origin of Species, it would be something like, all natural phenomenon must be explained through only material causes operating at the rate we see them today. That's a little cumbersome, but you got to capture the fact that it's not just material causes, it's the ones we see operating today. So it would take millions of years for the Grand Canyon to be carved out by the current Colorado River. Therefore, the Grand Canyon is millions of years old.
Yeah. Very uniformitarian, materialistic in his outlook. Okay, so we did our little summary there, and now we can jump into Nietzsche. And so rather than trying to give my one sentence summary here, let's just begin. So we've looked at his atheism. We've looked at his kind of what made it unique in terms of his background, his history. But when it comes to those worldview questions of how did I come into being, what happens when I die, talking about the nature of humanity within that framework. So I want to bring up this little bit of his and then get your thoughts. And I have a couple quotes that I'll pull in a little bit later to get you guys to react. Because I have to admit to both you guys, especially you, Owen, because you're our philosopher guy here that's far more versed in these philosophies as far as background and education, is that, man, it was a tough slog through Nietzsche for me. So it was not a fun read. Some of these I've really enjoyed. I'm not sure I really enjoyed Nietzsche that much. So it was tough to get through.
A little bit of flow of consciousness. He's just kind of going along, flow of consciousness, and you're going along with him. So if you're not too interested, like, he's not concise, he's not going to get to the point. Yeah, but also that style is the point. Yeah. Because that is reality. And so the message, what's the phrase? The medium is the message.
The medium is the message. Marshall McLuhan.
So Aristotle, well, we don't have anything from Aristotle. We just have his students' notes. So he's also somewhat hard to read, but the notes we have are more concise, more to the point. Here's the thesis. Here's my argument. And yeah, you won't see that in him. And I think the thing he's best known for is saying God is dead. Right. And just to clear this up, I don't think you guys think this, but you might have some listeners who think Nietzsche was saying there was some guy named God, and he died, and now we're living after that time. That's not what he means. The idea of God died in two senses. It was not true in the first place, but also we no longer live as if it even is true. And so what will we do post the idea of God? And he thinks that's a really good thing. So Christian apologists use him, and they might say that he is a kind of reductio ad absurdum of atheism. But that's because they're using the very theistic values that he's saying aren't real. So yes, it's a circular argument. If you like theistic values and God is dead, then the world looks terrible because it no longer looks like theistic values. But he's calling us back to pagan systems, pre-Socratic pagan systems, which don't operate on those standards and therefore can't be judged on those standards without begging the question.
Yeah, he's a very interesting individual, because what he wants us to wrestle with is, now that God is dead, now what? I think in his poem, The Madman, he says, God is dead. You and I have killed him. And he said something about what kind of sacred events will we, have to create now that God is dead? How did we wipe away the sun? And his point was, now that God is dead and the anchor, the foundation for all that we think about reality is gone, how now will you live? He's doing something Schaefferian in that sense. How now will you live now that God is dead? What will you do now? He's not, and I think we get caught up on the title or the statement, and we get so rattled by it, but we don't really think about the implications of what he's trying to get at. And this is why so many of the thinkers in his day really grabbed onto what he was saying, because he was saying, okay, God is dead. There's no God. There's no, the moral, preconditions that we lived in the world are now gone and wiped away. How now will you craft your future?
Yeah. And so this is where, and I'm glad you did take us down that, because that is a key part of his sort of atheist perspective on things. But then when it comes to the nature of humanity, I think we have to go to, at least first, to, even though this work came after, a year after this, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he uses this word Übermensch, right? The idea of the Superman that comes out. And I think there's an important distinction here between what, say, Darwin would say is this more mechanistic evolutionary process, to the power of humanity to sort of craft and shape our own identity. And so we are sort of masters of our own domain. We're the masters of our future. We're not slaves to the environment or to, again, our biology. And I think, of course, those ideas end up shaping, in large part, the more eugenic side of things later on, where we're going to kind of control humanity. But that's where his idea of our origin is, yes, it's evolution, but we're not really subject to it in the way, say, a Darwinian would have been. Any thoughts on the Übermensch thing before I throw out a couple quotes to you guys?
Yeah, well, I think you're right. That's the romantic philosophy responding against earlier mechanistic materialist philosophy. And that's where Nietzsche would be more attractive, let's say in our setting, which says humans are just interchangeable robot machines, big tech. and they're just objects to be sold things. And so the highest technology of humans have created, AI, is simply a psychological tool to figure out how to get you to buy something that's put forward on your screen. In contrast to that, the romantic says, no, we're not reducible to machines. And the purpose of life is not just kind of mathematical mechanism. It's the deep feeling of connection with being itself. And it's not analytic, which is that computer science side. It's intuitive. And so the feeling you have intuitively, for example, with nature, that's what Nietzsche is arguing for. And that's why I said I can play devil's advocate a little bit, sun devil's advocate as a ASU professor, to show where if you're stuck with two options, like Silicon Valley or Nietzsche, you'd pick Nietzsche. Right. But one really important thing about, you brought up Zarathustra, and for a lot of people that say, who's that? I don't know, why is he saying Zarathustra? Why not, thus spake Isaiah, or thus spake Jeremiah? Both of those could say something similar if his point was just about hypocrisy. But his point isn't about hypocrisy. He's saying that because he's invoking Babylonian mythology. And Babylonian mythology teaches that humans killed their deity. And his wife, because of that, the god's wife, set out in war against humanity, who lived in the dead body of their god. And the humans made a monster called Marduk who could defend them against the goddess who was attacking them. And so this monster is not a good thing, not moral, so to speak. Not like Michael the archangel, who shows up perfect. He's a monster, but he destroys or defends and destroys the creatures that the goddess is setting to kill the humans. And so he is their savior from that original deity. He's a Lucifer figure, but this is what Nietzsche is calling people back to. God is dead in that pagan sense, not in a Jeremiah sense that you're hypocrites, but in the pagan sense. And we have to learn what to do. Who do we look to as our help? Well, we look to ourselves. The God who made us gave us a bunch of rules, and we rebelled and said, I don't want your rules. I don't want to be your slave. So this is Yahweh. Yahweh tried to enslave us with rules. And instead, we determine who we are ourselves. So this is just the Luciferian reinterpretation of Genesis chapter 3. Mm-hmm. It's good for you to be your own God. That's the Superman you were asking about.
And that is a great summation. I was thinking about when you talked about the romantics. There's a verse in the Bible: "The Son of Man appeared to destroy the works of the devil." And I remember reading, how C.S. Lewis, discussed that verse and said it was something that fired up the spirit, because there's something mythic about it. He wasn't saying that it was a myth and didn't happen, but there's something out there that you look to and can really inspire the soul. And that's what Nietzsche
he loved what he called true myths.
Yes. That was Lewis. But this is what Nietzsche is trying to do for those people who want to will to power, the Ubermensch. He wants to inspire them to look inward and then to live out that inward inspiration and take over their own destinies, to be men of power, supermen, if you will.
Let me jump in, because
that's why for him,
Leroy's doing. You guys are both on something. I want to just give a couple quotes, and and then we'll go back to exactly what you were going to say, because I think we're at this point. Mm-hmm. But so for people who haven't read or listened along, here's kind of the way that Nietzsche puts it. So my first sort of quote here in my mind is sort of he's comparing the alpha predator, like to be an alpha predator, not a herd follower, is sort of like my thinking here. He says this: none of these ponderous herd animals, he's talking about a lot of the European democracy, that sort of thing. None of these herd animals wants to know or even sense that the general welfare is no ideal, no goal, no remotely intelligible concept, but only an emetic. And by that, he means a substance that causes vomiting, like if you take Ipecac. So he's saying this whole idea of the essentially this European sort of democratic process is an enigmatic, it's a vomitous sort of idea. And this other quote, my sort of one phrase summary is, don't just survive, dominate, I think is his whole sort of thing. He says, philologists should think before putting down the instinct of self-preservation as the cardinal instinct of an organic being. A living thing seeks above all to discharge its strength. Its life is will to power. Self-preservation is only one of the indirect and most frequent results. So he's trying to, again, this is what you guys were kind of talking about. I think it gets to those ideas. So Owen, you can jump back in off Leroy's comment, and maybe if you integrate thoughts from those quotes.
Well, from your quote there, how do we bring that up to contemporary time? It's being called a sheeple. Mm-hmm. And people use that phrase when they think they know the secret truth about what's really going on. I know what really is going on in Ukraine, and you're probably a sheeple who just listens to the media. And so that gets thrown around by everybody. But it's the idea that you're just following along. So in other words, this is something that people don't want to be. Nietzsche's right. The idea of the common good connects up with another aspect of him, which is that he's saying Christianity is slave religion. And it's specifically just Platonism watered down. And so what he means by that is that Plato taught that there is matter and spirit, and matter is essentially bad, and your goal of life is to flee matter to the spiritual realm, heaven. And most Christians, even today, they think that's what the gospel is. They didn't read Genesis chapter 1, that God made the world very good, and they didn't read John chapter 5, that there's a resurrection of the dead. You don't stay in the spirit realm, so to speak. You give your body back. And so most Christians think, yeah, be good, say the right prayer, and when you die, you'll go to heaven. And be good means follow that common good, which means you don't really do much in your life. You don't have a lot of aspirations beyond, I'll just, help other people, I guess. They'll lead good bourgeoisie lives. I'll plug them into a job where they get health care and whatnot. So it's the same kind of bourgeoisie sheeple that people today, Marxists today, would say, hey, that's not living. And so he's critiquing that kind of Christianity, and he's right to do so. But that's not the Christian message. But it is what a lot of Christians think. It's a lot of Christians are going to hear about that tomorrow, that the purpose of Jesus and his resurrection was so that you can escape Plato's cave and go to heaven. And so I think that in that sense, we can resonate with him as well and say, yeah, that idea of the common good does take away our individual need to lead a good life, a great life ourselves, to pursue greatness, to be super. And it also just teaches us that the material world isn't good. He's trying to romanticize the material world and get us back into material existence. And he sees that the pagans do that and the Platonists don't. So that's why all went wrong with Socrates, because Socrates doesn't care if he lives or dies. He'll go on to the spirit realm. But he advocates for what is called the Dionysian, which is the just abandonment of yourself to pure intuitive living. Mm-hmm. That's determining good and evil for yourself, not letting someone else determine it. And it's emerging yourself in this world and being in it, your animal existence.
If I can just glom onto that a little bit, I think this is something where the Catholics get right. This is exactly where I think they get right. And what do I mean by that? Is my wife and I were watching TV, and we were, watching all the folks in government, and we were just surprised at how many of those folks that were actively engaged in government policy, in the total sphere of government, how many of those folks were all Catholic. And I was kind of like, and we were both surprised. And then I started to think about something. We really think about, people who, in a Christian sphere who talked about developing themselves and actually going out in the world and make a difference. A lot of those folks are Catholic people. Whereas, from the non-Catholic side, we just want, to live a privatized, very, insular life where we have our holy huddle and our bubbles, and we don't go out in the world.
It's the effects of dispensationalism, right? The whole world's going to heck in a handbasket. Why get involved?
Fight, Leroy, fight!
I polish brass on a sinking ship.
But I don't think that's what I don't think that that's what dispensational. I think that that's what some
I threw a little
dispensational.
grenade into the mix.
You did,
Yeah.
you did. I think that that's what some dispensationalists think, but I don't think that that's what dispensationalism teaches. So I'll draw the
Yep.
distinction there.
But the only
But
thing I'd add to what you said about Catholics, though, is that they're the ones teaching the common good philosophy that he's objecting to. So their
Right,
view
no,
would be you just go along with this common good.
Yeah.
You don't aspire to greatness. And they especially teach the world is bad. The best life is the monk who gives up sex and gives
Right.
up any kind of enjoyment. And Nietzsche's saying, no, that's not the best life. The best life is you give yourself to animal passions because that's what we are.
Yeah, I'm going to agree. I'm not trying to valorize all of Catholicism.
Sure,
I'm just
yeah.
simply saying from that narrow sphere, they know what it means to go out into the world and do something, and to get
Yep.
people, regular church people, fired up to think about the world in that way is very, very difficult. It is very difficult.
Yeah. So, what's interesting is as I listen to you guys both talk about this, and this is why, even though we're doing this through these worldview framework, asking these very specific questions, it's so easy. Hopefully people see these questions really all blend together, right? So we're using this sort of, here are the questions we're all asking, and we try to tear them apart. But, it's so easy to go from the nature of man to the nature of morality, because those things all do. And that's sort of the illustrative point here is these are holistic concepts. He's just not tearing apart in a systematic way, because as you said earlier, Owen, it's more of a flow of thought. So these ideas blend together: the nature of where I begin with, the nature of the world, the nature of humanity, of politics, of morality. All of those are sort of just one collective thought. So as we're trying to pull these apart in individual questions, what I've really, and I kind of guess I knew it before we even began this journey going through all of these, but to think this way is very difficult to make sure, do these ideas make sense? And you've got to try to tease them out, but it's hard because they all eventually do interconnect, especially in a worldview that's far more robust. And Nietzsche has a robust worldview in the sense that it does internally cohere in many ways. I mean, not that it's obviously from a Christian worldview perspective, I'd say it's deeply flawed and there's errors, but I'm saying internally he's trying to make sense of all the elements of life. And he does a pretty decent job of trying to give a consistent answer to that, but it does all flow together. So move on then just to these ideas, these next worldview questions. How does he answer these ideas? What's my purpose? What's the right thing to do? How can I fulfill my purpose? How will it be judged? Again, I'm going to blur those into one big ball because it's going to be really impossible to tease out specific elements because he's not writing that kind of a project. But let me do this one on humanity and get your thoughts on this, because this gets now to, it goes from the nature of man towards the sort of right moral attitude or ethic. So Nietzsche says this in his book, Beyond Good and Evil: none of these ponderous herd animals wants to know or even senses that the general welfare is no ideal, no goal, no remotely intelligible concept, but only this is partly what I quoted before, but is enigmatic. Actually, let me just skip that quote. I take that back. I don't want to do that whole quote again because we already kind of covered that one. Let's go to the master morality versus the slave morality. I think that's the better one to go in this section. He says, he compares aristocracy, the aristocratic sort of British mentality, as the master morality. Well, not even as exhibited by the British, but that aristocratic idea is master morality. Democracy is more of a slave morality. But this, Owen, is where you kind of bring in Christianity earlier. He says, Christianity has been the most calamitous kind of arrogance yet. Men, not high and hard enough to have any right to form man as artists. Men, not strong and farsighted enough to let the foreground law of thousand-fold failure and ruin prevail. Though I cost them sublime self-conquest. He's very artsy in his language. Men, not noble enough to see the abysmal different order of rank, chasm of rank between man and man. Such men have so far held sway over the fate of Europe, with their equal before God, until finally a smaller, almost ridiculous type of herd animal, something eager to please, sickly and mediocre, has been bred the Europe of today. And he goes on to say, and this is the last section of this quote, this goes on in a different part. He says this: "The time for petty politics is over. The very next century will bring the fight for the dominion of the earth, the compulsion to large-scale politics." So, and there's a lot in there. Hopefully you guys, I gave you enough to work with. Take those ideas. What is he talking about when he's talking about this, the equality before God, and how that's created this herd instinct, and why is that a slave morality? What's the solution to that, especially in this sort of more one world government as we see it, maybe see it lived out today, to large scale politics?
Yeah, let me again be a Sun Devil's advocate for Nietzsche and see if I can get you both to agree with the quote you just read. Because let me take a couple angles. One angle is what he just said has been the topic of every kids movie for decades. Every excerpt down to the current Minecraft movie was raised on this idea that you've got the herd, which is usually represented by the jocks, and then you've got the picked on kid. And the picked on kid is special, and he has something unique to offer, but he's bullied by the herd. And so he has to dig deep and get this inspirational message to be himself and shine as himself. And then that makes him be raised above the herd, above the jocks who are just merely learning how to play a game, a team sport, which is team, it's herd. And that I could have just described any number of dozens of movies. And we resonate with that because we say, yeah, I want to be unique. I want to be something different. I want to make my contribution in the world. And what he's saying is democracy takes that away from us. Democracy says you're told what to do. You fit into a bourgeoisie, middle class, or you aspire to be it. And that's where you live out your life. You get a car, you get a house in suburbia, you get a Tesla, you have a couple kids, you have a retirement package. That's your job. That's a good life. You're working towards the common good. And he's saying, no, that's a terrible life. That's not a human life. You need to be the one who breaks out of that. And that's how you can understand him saying, by creating your own values. Now, earlier I said, I do think that is ultimately the story in Genesis 3, but he's also applying that in a way where you could say, yeah, the context then, I don't think it really counted as Christianity. Kierkegaard is also objecting to this from a Christian perspective a little bit earlier, but the same kinds of objections. Your view of Christianity is you just go and keep a pew warm on Sundays and you give some money to the charity. And if you've done that, you're going to heaven. Mm-hmm. It's a herd life, he says. So you need to, he says, the noble man or man of experience itself is the one who is value creating. You create values. You could take that objectively, which he does mean against God, but just in the context here, you create values against that cookie cutter existence, which is made by big corporations because that's the best way they have of controlling you. They control the masses. You've got your iPhone. You check it every day on your way to Starbucks, and you make sure your 401k is doing okay, and that's your existence. And he's saying, no, there's more to life than that. That's the kind of mechanistic life. You need to break out of that and become the one who determines your own fate. But then he does project that onto God as well. As long as God is there, you'll be stuck in that. And so you've got to rebel against God. So I think that's why he comes down to us. One quick application. This is why Foucault is called his best disciple, because everything you inherit should be questioned, including in our day, gender. Someone told you that because of the things on your body, you have to live a certain way. No, you live the way you want to live.
I'm going to pull on a string on that a little bit different. We talked about the romanticizing. And really what he's doing is romanticizing manhood. And he's appealing to that, what he believes that deep innate sense within men to conquer and to go out and do great things. I mean, I think of the movies that I watched as a kid. I mean, one of my favorite movies that when I watched as a kid is The Four Feathers. I mean, most people never heard of that movie. One of my other favorite movies, Up Periscope, with Rock Hudson being the Navy diver who goes behind enemy lines. He's appealing to that very masculine desire to be great. And what he's saying is that Christianity has dampened that. There's a book that I was a small groups pastor and I was tasked to take the men at our church through this book called Why Men Hate the Church, right? That's a real book called Why Men Hate the Church. And I can
It's a big problem.
I can guarantee you that one of the reasons why is this thing that Nietzsche is articulating here and trying to tackle. And that is appealing to men to go out and do something great. And I think in Christian history, we had that zeal and that desire. We had great examples, great witnesses, the apostles, the martyrs, the apologists, great men and women throughout Christian history. We had that appeal, that zeal. I think that zeal fueled the missionary movement earlier within Christendom. But I think, it's part of the reason why we have the so-called Christian nationalists who are appealing to guys like Aristotle and many others to try to drag that out of young men today.
The manosphere.
The manosphere is exactly an appeal to that same kind of perspective. So what Nietzsche articulated in a very flowery and romantic way are the same ideas that people are trying to appeal to men today.
Well, and I think, let me throw out a statistic that will help Joe. Joe, you can go tell your dean this. My college at ASU brags that it's 70% women enrollment. And they want to, and the wording they have is, that's a vulnerable group that we need to do even more for. Well, wait, hasn't that group won? It's 70%. Like, isn't that mean now the men are the vulnerable group? But it taps into what you're saying, Leroy, which is, why don't men want to go to university? Precisely because of this. You're just taught, here's how to get a job. So you sit in a cubicle and you make enough money so you can fund a 401k and retire at 65 and play golf. And men don't have any vision that's given to them to do great things. And so I think the thing that Nietzsche is seeing is that this is the end of the Reformation, let's call it. Mm-hmm. The missionary zeal that you mentioned was behind colonialism, and it was a race between the Jesuits and the Protestants in the world. But then you get the need for money to support that war. So when you hear about the Spanish bringing money home, it's not just because they want to sit on large piles of money. It's because they wanted to fund their attacks against the English, like the Spanish Armada, and they need money to do that. And the English are in the same boat. So they say, well, they just wanted Jamestown for money. Yes, to protect the Church of England and Protestantism. But then you get to a phase where it's just about the money, which is the banking phase and the slavery phase. And that's what Nietzsche is looking at and saying that's what Christianity produced. And many critics of Christianity today still point to that. When they say colonialism, they don't think about missionaries and anti-slavery, which the Christians also did. They think about the banking where you want money so that you can plug into the system, and that's the matrix.
Right.
And that's what you get plugged into. And so young men are saying, Nietzsche's saying as a young man, I want more than that. And isn't it too bad that Christianity didn't offer him that more? Because there's nothing bigger than the vision of the Great Commission. That mission is enough for every individual to have their own sphere, so to speak, where you get to contribute.
Yeah, so you started off by saying, convince us to maybe agree with him at some point. Mm-hmm. I don't think I agree with him. I think he agrees with Christianity at some point. But the problem, and in terms of sociopraxy, Nietzsche does what a lot of Marxists do. They critique and they analyze the flaws they see within the culture. They do it pretty well. Like critical race theory observes racism in the culture, and aside from redefinitions of that, which I would heartily disagree with, but they do observe, hey, there is an injustice here. There's something bad. But the only reason that they make those correct observations is because they unintentionally borrow from a Christian worldview. And so what Nietzsche does get right is not because Nietzsche's a brilliant thinker. It's because he's influenced by some aspect of the Christian worldview that it's not being lived out within his cultural context, especially like the idea that, I think you're right, Owen, and you bring out this idea that we're called to something great. We're called to act in God. And Leroy, your example earlier with missionaries, the willingness to risk life, to adventure, to go out for the sake of the gospel. You look at the early apostles and the disciples who risked everything. That sense of wonder at the world and adventure and there's something worth being brave for is gone in this sort of
sheeple mentality that you bring up. And so in that sense, he makes a correct observation. But again, I don't think it's but his solution to the problem, his cure for the problem is based on a flawed ontology of reality of who humanity is and why we're wrong. So, or why there's error that exists. Yeah, sure. Jump in.
I'm up against a time limit at 10 here, but I want to do something. We haven't yet got to his argument. So I think you're 100% right, Joe, that the anti-Christians, usually they do see something they're working on. But what he's arguing for, we've given a couple different things, but at the base of it goes back to what you said earlier, that he has a coherent presentation. I think that would really upset him. He doesn't want a coherent presentation. He's rejecting...
That's trying to be nice.
Apollinarian philosophy, things like the law of non-contradiction. Those are part of slavery. Those are the logos. And as long as you are under the logos, you are a slave. And so he doesn't say, here's a premise, here's a conclusion, because that's not what he's doing. He's trying to get you into not an anti-logos or non-logos mindset of the pre-Socratic pagan. And so he is, quote unquote, arguing for what he calls the Dionysian, which means abandonment to just intuition. Mm-hmm. Therefore, he's not saying Christians, you're doing it. He's not like Martin Luther, say, hey, Christians, you're teaching false things. Let's be consistent. He'd say, no, you shouldn't be a sheeple, but don't worry about consistency either. That makes you a slave.
Well, no, but his consistent element of that, what I mean by coherence, though, is that what he's saying is the nature of humanity is to, the will to power, as long as you follow that nature, you're in alignment. You can't be a hypocrite as long as you're striving to will to power. I mean, that's where I think he's coherent and internally consistent, not consistent with a Christian. It wouldn't correspond to a Christian worldview. Yeah. That it wouldn't match.
He wants abandonment. The Romantics like those intuitions. Mm-hmm. And that's why he's more on the side of art than philosophy. I want to be abandoned to my intuitions. And if you needed to see like a 2-minute clip of Nietzsche, like what's his philosophy in movie form, it's Colonel Kurtz talking to Marlowe in The Apocalypse Now and describing Western morality of inoculating little children in a Vietnamese village. And then they leave and the Viet Cong come back and chop off every one of the little kids' arms and put them in a pile for the GIs to find later. And for Colonel Kurtz, that pushed him beyond good and evil into just the pure intuition of power. And then there's a whole scene of sacrificing an animal and just giving yourself over to a pagan ritual. You're not supposed to think about it and say, yeah, that's some really good points, Colonel Kurtz. I'm going to write my dissertation on that. You're supposed to just give yourself into this intuition.
Can I just jump in at what's amazing is when you extrapolate his ideas out to how they affected the people or how they influenced the people who followed him. Now it can make sense for why those men did the atrocities that they did in Germany, because these people needed to be wiped out. And to be a man is to pursue power, and it is to enforce your power over those who you view as weaker or those who you view as destroying, humanity. And I'm not
parasitical on society.
Yeah, I'm not saying.
And what was the main group that they justified doing that? They did it because they said these are the bankers.
Yes.
That keep control of society, that make you plug into the matrix.
There is a book called The Vanishing Word, and written by a guy named Arthur Hunt, and he has a segment on the Dionysian view there, and he talks about Nietzsche's discussion on beholding and becoming, and why it was good for men to behold the Greek gods and pour meaning into the Greek gods so that they could reap back meaning for themselves. And what he's urging men to do is to pour meaning into this ideal so that you can reap back meaning for yourself. And if that ideal is the Ubermensch, it's the conqueror, it's the thing that makes you who you are, then so be it. Pursue it with all passion.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's really, right now there's only one message on earth of conquering in the exploratory sense. and that's Elon Musk going to Mars.
Mm-hmm.
And young men resonate with this idea of, yeah, let's go out there and discover the new thing to do. And isn't it sad that there's not a corollary Christian one that says, hey, articulate the Great Commission, here's what it is, and we're going to spread the knowledge of God across the whole earth and disciple the nations. The only one out there right now is just this very secular, let's go to Mars, and then what? Well, we'll colonize it, and then what? Like, it's just purely material. There's nothing, or maybe it's evolutionary. There's also a kind of Space Odyssey 2001. Maybe we'll meet our creators there. We'll find an alien civilization that is the one that built us. But there's no message for the young men, which is why we're getting some really disgusting expressions of the manosphere and having to push back and say, wait, no, don't follow Andrew Tate. That's on the list of some of the worst ideas ever. But Christians need this message.
That's good. Wait, let me jump in. So, because I know, Owen, you got to go. We're bumping up towards the end of our time too, as well. But I do think, we always ask at the end of these things, where do we see it in the culture, and what is the opportunity for Christians? And I think Owen's comment there really got on one of those points that I think is a good takeaway for people about, we need that broader image than just colonizing Mars. I mean, there's got to be something more significant, like the then what, and the Andrew Tate sort of masculinity that Leroy, you started with, and his name came up when you were talking, and of course, Owen. I think, that sort of manliness defined by this Nietzschean value set of I'm the apex predator, and whatever I do is right morally because of that. So I think that's an excellent closing sort of, hey, here's Christians, here's where you need to engage these ideas and develop a stronger, more robust biblical framework for dealing with these issues. Leroy, do you have one for you? Like what's the takeaway? Maybe just building off that, or if you have an additional one that you think is where Christians have to get at it.
Where Christians have to get at it is, pastors, you need to stop building your kingdom and your church and keeping men siloed in your building and train them and send them out into the world and make a difference. Stop waiting for somebody else to do it, right? Stop building your kingdom and your church and stop siloing these men, develop them and send them out into the world.
Yeah, amen. That's great.
Amen to that. Yeah, I've run across that way too many places. My sort of closing.
I wrote an article about that called what was the title? Something like "Against the Ex-Pastor" or the Twitter pastor. Because you'll find the guys who they're Twitter pastors. They got a big following, and that's about it.
Yeah. Yeah, my sort of big takeaway, I'll try to add it to a different line of thought, because I agree wholeheartedly with both of what you guys said as far as the big takeaways. I'm glad, Owen, you brought in the sort of Musk sort of man to Mars kind of thing, and then what? I think that's really good. I wasn't thinking along those lines, but that is really good. Leroy, I'm glad you brought in the sort of the Andrew Tate mannishness type of thing, which again, I think is a very Nietzschean, both of those. But I want to circle back to one thing, and I'll try to pick a different area that I think Owen kind of brought up a little bit earlier. This is the idea of, the concept of diversity is our strength. And I think that's the whole thing you see, like in the Lego movie, you talked about, like, I'm rising above, I'm not a sheeple, and I'm all being diverse, that kind of thing.
Yep.
But I think the problem with that is what Nietzsche brings into that. He would talk about that idea of being unique and, not being a follower, but he denies any sense of unity among humanity, because he denies that Christian idea that we're all B'Tselem Elohim, made in the image of God. And he sees that as ultimately the immorality of Christianity. It's not, Christianity interpreted through the lens of democracy problems, right? And Christianity interpreted through the lens of any political system or social structure like that. To be sheep is not how we were, because we didn't see the early disciples being sheep. They were, other than being sheep of Christ, but they were very bold for Christ against the flow of culture. Yeah. But for me, I think to be that idea of be what God has uniquely made you to be, it only succeeds in building a strong culture, a strong civilization, if it's built on the foundation that we all have something at the core that unites us, and that's that we're image bearers of God, and we all have intrinsic sacred worth. that so I can be whatever I want to be. I can exhibit my masculinity, or I could be adventurous, whatever I can, but I can't violate the worthiness, the sacredness, the dignity, the value in other human beings to do it. And Nietzsche, of course, would have no problem with that because I'm just fulfilling my own great desires. So I think for me, that's where I would take that. If plurality just means a difference of practice and social, like, hey, we got different kinds of foods and cultural expressions, that's great. But if it's a plurality of value in terms of the essence of human nature, then that's not a strength.
Yeah.
Diversity in that sense is not a strength. It's a weakness because it forces us to not value the other person as equal in God's footprints. And last thoughts from you guys? I already got last thoughts, second last thoughts, but then I'll close this up.
Yeah, well, I think just real quick, the same thing that I had mentioned before, but applied to what you just said. The machine has taken over culture, for example, education. So it would say, be diverse, be yourself, but it's all in the same way. And so that's this idea, raging against the machine, raging against the thing that takes away your individuality and expressing who you are. I think Lisa Simpson said it really well this way to teenagers: you're all rebelling in a conformist fashion. And so Nietzsche's tapping into exactly what you said, that we're individuals made by God. And so we do have something in us, the image of God, but we've given that over to, let's say, the banking system. All we think about all day is our 401k. And we need to reclaim that as Christians. But his path is to say, get rid of the logos altogether. So it's really, he's the anti-logos path, and the Christianity has to present, no, the logos path is actually how you find that fulfillment.
Amen.
There is so much more that we could say about Nietzsche's philosophy, but for now I want to encourage my brothers and sisters to go out, till the soil of culture, so that you can raise the roof on the death of morality by exposing your friends and family to the enduring holiness of God. I hope you'll come back and join me in the next episode. In the meantime, don't forget to follow and rate the show on your favorite podcasting service. And if you want to participate with me in a subscribers-only question and answer, you can sign up through my website, morethancake.org.